There we go. So as we get started too, I'd like to introduce myself. My name is Erin Hildreth. I am the Vice President of Communications at responsibility.org. Again, we thank you all for joining us for the Impairing Hemp Beverages, What Parents and Law Enforcement Need to Know to Keep Kids Safe webinar. At this time, I will pass the floor over to the Executive Director of responsibility.org, Leslie Kimball. Leslie?
Thank you, Erin. And on this next slide for about responsibility.org, Erin has been an enormous help getting this webinar together. So I want to thank her. So thank you very much, Erin, and advance thanks to Heather and Jayme. We've worked on this for a number of months, so we're very excited to be here today and hope that you all will find this as interesting as we have as we've started to work on this. So just a little bit for those of you who don't know about responsibility.org, we've been around for just about 35 years. We have three missions. We fight drunk driving and all forms of impaired driving. We fight underage drinking, and then we also empower adults to make responsible decisions about alcohol if they choose to drink. So thank you for joining us today. And we couldn't be here without our board of directors. So there's 13 board of director member companies that make our work possible. And we appreciate their funding as we start this webinar today. So thank you to them. And then I'd also just like to make sure that we introduce Heather and Jayme. So I'm going to let them introduce themselves. I've been so impressed with them. So again, thank you. Heather, we'll start with you if you could just give us a little bit of your background.
Okay, thank you. I'm Heather Barkholtz. I'm an assistant professor at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and I hold a joint appointment with both the School of Pharmacy and the Wisconsin State Laboratory of Hygiene, which is Wisconsin's public health lab. In this role, I work on quantifying or studying impairment and how to detect drugs of abuse, so a very strong like forensic toxicology perspective.
Jayme.
All right. I'm Jayme Derbyshire. I'm an officer with Montgomery County Department of Police. I really appreciate responsibility.org for allowing me to be here today and to speak briefly about this important topic. With Montgomery County Police, I've been with them for 23 years now, primarily doing traffic enforcement. My position falls under the traffic division, but with that, a lot of training, especially with regard to cannabis impairment. And so I'm fortunate enough to be here today to talk a little bit more about that.
Thank you both. I trust that everyone will be as impressed with Jayme and Heather as we are. So thank you again. And before we get going, I just wanted to sort of level set sort of why we're here. So Erin, if you don't mind going to the next slide. So we as responsibility.org and also our panelists, we do not take a formal position on the legal status of these products that we're going to talk about today. We are just trying to do this as an educational, from an educational perspective. We all want to keep kids safe. I think that's everyone's mission. And we genuinely care. So just wanted to sort of level set where we're coming from today before we get going. So thank you for that. So I think as we get going, so we're going to talk about law enforcement and parents and what they need to know. So I'll start with Heather and ask Heather, what are impairing hemp beverages? Are they the same as THC beverages? And how are they different? And can you tell us about this? Some in just my daily life of dealing with my parent friends and just people, a lot of folks just have no idea what these products are, and other people are very familiar with these products. So if you could just give us some background on that to get us going, we'd really appreciate that.
Awesome. Yeah, great question. It's a messy space. So, just to kind of get some jargon and lingo out of the way, I like to think about these beverages a lot like looking at the back of a box for nutritional information. So, a lot of us are pretty familiar or comfortable with looking at, how much protein, how many calories, if we're trying to avoid sugar or salt. We know where to find that information on all of the food products we purchase. But for these cannabis products, this is CBD beverages, intoxicating hemp beverages, or cannabis beverages. There's no standardized way that all of the information is laid out for us, like in the food aisles at the stores. So to start our conversation, hemp and cannabis come from the same plant species. And the legal distinction, at least federally, states kind of do their own things sometimes, is based on delta 9 THC concentration. So hemp is anything that contains 0.3% delta 9 THC or less, and cannabis is then everything else, so that contains higher levels of delta 9 THC. And this is a result of that 2018 Farm Bill that created a pathway for hemp-derived cannabinoids to enter the market. And really, hemp-derived cannabinoids are when chemists synthesize that CBD. Yep, you can go to the next slide. That's a perfect segue. It's that CBD molecule into other things. But your body and your receptors in your body can't tell if the delta 9 THC was synthesized by a chemist or synthesized by a plant. It's the same molecule to your body. So this is kind of this like weird space where you can have a hemp-derived cannabinoid and a plant-derived cannabinoid, but to your body, they're kind of the same thing. So in that vein, some beverages contain THC or related compounds like the cannabinoids, and these can impair people's ability to think, your reaction time, judgment, and driving ability, which we'll hear more from, I'm sure, from Jayme in a few slides. And these are different from CBD beverages because that THC can produce intoxication or the feeling of being high. So one thing I've heard a lot in my research is that people will incorrectly assume that hemp means not impairing. That's not the case in this market. And one of the challenges with THC beverages is that people may underestimate impairment because the drink can look like a sparkling water or a soda or a wellness drink. So then for the next slide, please. I also included this because I think it's really important to talk about that the cannabis use and its availability is increasing a lot, but particularly from the perspective of young people, they're perceiving it as less risky than historically. So this is just very important to keep in mind when we're talking about people and their exposure to an interaction with these products. Next slide. So looping back to the nutritional label, I have some suggestions for how to identify and understand these hemp-derived impairing hemp or CBD products beverages. So the risk with this, from my perspective and in my opinion, is not just the cannabinoid that is in it, it's misunderstanding the dose. So you can't assume that a product is non-intoxicating because it says hemp. You need to look for the list of compounds within the product and identify if it has THC in it and its content in milligrams or mg, and so that would be your dose. And then it's also very important to look at the number of servings in that container. So I'm used to a soda can being a single container, and then the information on the can is how much sugar I'm going to get from that can of Coke. Whereas if you look at a THC product, it may claim that there are 10 servings in a container for whatever reason. And it's unlikely that I'm going to drink 1/10 of a container of Coke. And that also, if you're trying this for the first time, start with a low dose and go slow. Start at maybe 2.5 milligrams and see how you feel. Wait several hours, which we'll go into in a little bit. And then just to make sure that you don't drive for an extended period of time after you have consumed it. So the next slide. I've consolidated some of the myths that I hear a lot when I talk about my research, and they are here. So I think we'll cover all of these as we go through today, but this slide deck will be made available to everybody. And then I think next up is Jayme.
Great, thank you. So I at least just wanted to hit on, before we went into our conversation, just some of the general indicators of impairment that we look for as officers, but also that parents can look for. So as officers, we have different levels of training, obviously. We have officers who have been on for a short period of time and a longer period of time, some that have really extensive training and are called what we know as drug recognition experts. And so those individuals are looking for things a little bit more of these indicators, but some of these are simple enough that parents could easily look at them, as far as it's not just one of them's present and you can say, oh yes, this kid is impaired or is high on cannabis, but in the totality of the circumstance, it's possible that you could put them all together and say, okay, maybe I should look a little bit further into this. What do I know about my kid and what am I looking for? So as far as, sorry, I have that slide. I want to go over it quickly, but it's good. I have it on paper. So some of the things that we look for as officers that are pretty simple that even parents could look for are just pupil dilation. Not everyone who consumes a cannabis-based product is going to have dilated pupils, but it is a good indicator that we see often with regard to cannabis consumption, whether that be a beverage with high THC content or whether it be someone who has ingested it via inhalation, smoking, or vaping, something of that nature. Other things that people talk often about and that we see and that researchers see is an elevated pulse rate and elevated blood pressure. Obviously, you're probably not going to go around taking your child's pulse, but again, these are just indicators that we look for, vital signs, just indicators that something is different with their body, and it's could be attributed to the fact that they ingested some drug. As far as eye appearance go, one thing we often look at, and I'm sure everyone's heard it referenced with regard to anyone consuming cannabis products, is reddened conjunctiva. So essentially what looks like pink eye. So that's something that we look for as well. Lots of times people think that that is associated with actually inhalation and the smoke from the product, but it's actually not. So you could do an edible and you could still have someone present with reddened conjunctiva, as opposed to them just smoking it. Another thing we look for is eyelid tremors. Pretty simple test that we do on the roadside. And what we do is we just have the individual stand there and close their eyes, and you'll see their eyes flutter underneath. That's a really good indicator of potential cannabis use. Again, not everyone who has eyelid tremors is using cannabis, but it's something that we look for, with the totality of circumstance to determine whether cannabis could be one of the impairing factors, whether it be driving or whether we're interacting with a kid in school or something of that nature. Some other things that you might notice are body tremors. Someone acting disoriented, euphoria, impaired memory, since cannabis has been proven to impact memory, drowsiness. Some of that will depend on what product they're actually using, but you could see drowsiness and impaired perception of time and distance. So they may think that 30 seconds has passed, but it could be much shorter. It could be 15 seconds. It could be a minute and a half. So that's something that we see with cannabis use as well. Mood changes, paranoia, lack of concentration, increased appetite, the munchies that everyone talks about. And there has been a little bit of research talking about sedation with high CBD content products. So, just looking or feeling lethargic in that sense. But again, the important thing to note is that everyone is different. So these indicators could be present for some, but they're not the be all end all. It's not, if you have all of these, that it's definitely cannabis. There's other factors, but these are just some easy signs to observe and to consider if you're suspicious of potential cannabis ingestion. Next slide. So just to continue on that a little bit more, some of those indicators are listed to the right as well that I already spoke of, but then some other indicators that are listed to the left of your screen are things that we look for as officers. I think for the officers that are listening here today, just want to touch on a lot of our younger officers. We do such a good job training on alcohol impairment, and we speak heavily to what we call as horizontal gaze nystagmus, or the jerking of the eyes, as people will say. And I think a lot of officers, when they're running through field tests, are concerned when they don't have that because we put so much emphasis on that. But with cannabis, you don't have that. And so it's really important as officers to recognize that you won't see horizontal gaze nystagmus. You won't see vertical gaze nystagmus. You will see something that we call, or you could see something that we call lack of convergence, so the eye's inability to cross. And if you're A-RIDE trained or if you're DRE trained, you'll definitely be looking for that as well. And then again, I spoke a little earlier about that pupil dilation, so that's something that you could see as well. So again, just a few general indicators that I wanted to hit on, but I think the really important piece is everybody's different. Cannabis, we still have a lot to learn. We don't know what we don't know about cannabis. And so these are things that we often see that we can speak to, but it's definitely not the be all end all. And again, everyone presents differently, and there's a lot of variability in there with regard to product used, what's consumed. Is it a beverage? Is it an edible? What have they consumed most recently that's impacting them? So again, just that brief overview, but I know we're going to talk further in our Q&A, so I don't want to go too much into it, but at least gives a little insight.
Thank you, Jayme. Excuse me. Thank you, Jayme. I think the next slide is about, so Jayme just said there's a lot we know and don't know. So Heather, if you're willing to go over this one, this is a fascinating slide to me. I think it answers a lot of questions, but also doesn't answer a lot of questions. So we'd love to hear from you, Heather.
Yeah, of course. And I'm going to give a high level overview. So I'm not going to get, I know when people see graphs, sometimes they're like, oh goodness. So I'm not going to get into the weeds. The things that are really important to know is that we most of us understand how alcohol feels. Most of us can pretty well predict what like one drink versus three drinks is going to feel like, and can get ourselves to a level we're comfortable with pretty reproducibly or reliably. That is not necessarily the case with cannabis or THC. So THC effects vary from person to person. So what may be one dose for someone that's their preferred dose may be way too much or not enough for another person to feel effects. And so the effects of THC, when those start, we call this the onset of effects. This can be delayed from what is expected, particularly if someone is used to smoking cannabis and then they shift to consuming it via an edible, like a gummy or a brownie, or drinking it like in a beverage. This can really change the whole time course and the what that person feels from the substance, even though it's the same substance. So it's good to keep that in mind. And that's why when I talked earlier about starting low, going slow, waiting for several hours, it's because of this delayed onset with the cannabis products. Now, when you put anything in a beverage, it creates this space for combining with alcohol, right? Particularly in the younger, more experimental crowd. So when you do that, it's important to know that this is one of the instances where the two drugs, when combined, that's alcohol and THC, can be more than 1 + 1 = 2. So this is a situation where you may have 1 + 1 = 3. So that can be kind of dangerous for people. And the effects, when combined, can be more severe and less predictable than if you used each substance alone. So even if you're very comfortable with alcohol and you're very comfortable with alcohol or with THC, if you combine them for the first time, that can be a very different situation. So that's just kind of what these graphs are attempting to illustrate.
Thank you, Heather. And we may come back to this too, but thank you for doing that. And just, we mentioned it already, but we will send out the deck and we will send out the sources so that everyone has them, including these slides that I'll touch on briefly. But we have gotten some questions ahead of time. So we assume that those of you listening today may also have these questions about sort of what are the legality of these products. And as you can tell, regarding state level, they're very varied. So I'm not going to go through all of them, but some states have prohibited them. Some allow them in adult use marijuana channels. Some are regulated, and some have not regulated these products at all. And then, Erin, if you don't mind going to the next slide. So as Jayme, I think it was Jayme, but as someone mentioned earlier, there was a farm bill, and that federal law will exclude these products with more than 0.4 mg of THC from the definition of hemp come November. But right now, these products are legal in many of the states. You can see all the details on the slide. And, you know, in my world, I continue to see some of them advertised. I continue to see some of them at stores or restaurants that I go to. So they are out there in the state of Maryland, DC, Virginia. We just wanted to be sure that folks were aware of that and also knew the laws in their state. But again, we will send this out so you don't have to screenshot these slides. And then I think we'll turn to our discussion. We've gotten one question in the chat already, but please feel free, if you've joined today, please feel free to ask us questions. That's why Jayme and Heather are here. They are, as you can tell, a wealth of knowledge, and we're still so thankful. So we'll turn to some questions, Jayme and Heather, and Erin. Thank you for helping us with the chat questions too. So the first one is, you know, when you think about kids, I have 2 kids, many of us have kids. Do these kids know that these products are out there? And, you know, what should we be concerned about regarding these products and youth? Either one of you guys can take
I'm happy to start off.
Yeah.
So I think the important thing is kids know more than what we think they know usually. So they absolutely know that these products are out there. And I think kind of to address a little bit what Heather had talked about with perception of risk, that's huge right now, especially with regard to kids. They're kind of growing up at a time where legalization is really changing with regard to cannabis, and the narrative is really changing with regard to cannabis. And so for them, it's this perception of risk is it's safer, and no one says safer than what, but it's safer, and so they hear that, and that's what they're kind of going with, and so we're actually seeing a lot of kids that are promoting amongst their friends the use of cannabis beverages or the use of cannabis products, more so than alcohol. It seems to be something that that group is more comfortable dealing with in that realm. And that's not something that we saw, before, like probably 10, 15 years ago. So I think, it's important for parents to realize that kids are very much aware to a certain extent, but probably not to an extent in that they would make good decisions regarding the products, right? Because it's in colorful containers and the serving size, as Heather had stated, is very confusing. You could have a can that's one serving, you could have it. They actually sell them. They have bottles with a medicine cap on top so that you can actually, like you would for cough syrup, that you would measure out your servings, and there's 17 servings in that bottle. Most kids, I have kids, I know that they wouldn't be reading packages that closely. They take off the top and they start drinking. So I think it's important for parents to have the conversation because your kids probably know about these products. And so I think talking about it and talking about the risks are equally as important as, the other side that's preaching, hey, this is a safer alternative. And so I really think that conversation between parents and child is probably most effective. Talk about some of the potential risks that we know. We don't have a lot of research on these products yet. We know a lot about alcohol, not so much about cannabis. And some of the research we have is kind of scary, as far as it could be linked to psychosis amongst juveniles. Kids don't hear that, they hear the good stuff and not really the bad stuff. And so I think it's important for parents to do their research and then inform their children as well.
I totally agree. And then to add and complement is that, like you said, the kids are aware that these things are out there. They're talking to their friends group. So it's important as parents, I also have two children, that we are also educated. So it's important to remember that these beverages may not look like a beer. And so they may be easily mistaken for an ordinary or, like a kombucha style beverage. And that if you're choosing to bring them into the home to consume on your own, like you would a beer, that you treat them like alcohol and or like a medication or something like that, and you secure them, store them securely, and that's out of sight, out of reach, locked up, depending on your home situation.
You all beat me to my second question, so thank you. And then Jayme, for you specifically, how does law enforcement approach these products? You talked a little bit about the impairment, but are you all seeing them? Does law enforcement know about them across the country? Can you talk a little bit about that?
We are seeing them. Definitely. It is something that we're trying to catch up to as well, because for the longest time we talk about what we're looking for when we suspect impairment, especially with regard to operating a motor vehicle. So, we talk a lot about the odor of an alcoholic beverage, or we talk about the smell of burnt marijuana. We don't often talk about a fruity, colorful can containing potentially, a cannabis infused drink or a hemp, infused beverage. We don't talk about that really. So that's something that we're trying to catch up on. The important thing for law enforcement is, and for parents is impairment's impairment. So if they're a little bit off of their norm, if something doesn't seem right, I mean, when we're looking at impairment, it's just functioning at a level other than normal, essentially for us. So, and that could be a great difference. You could have just very minor impairment, or you could have substantial impairment. So it just really depends on the product and what's being consumed. But I think parents are probably better at that than law enforcement. They know their kids, so you can tell when your kid's a little off. Law enforcement, we don't know the people we're interacting with, when we're on those traffic stops. So it takes a little bit more for us to ask a lot of questions, to kind of really pay attention to our surroundings and what could be in that center console, what, is in the vehicle. Is that can that looks like an energy drink really an energy drink, or is it something else?
Yeah, great answers. We do have a few. I'm going to jump to, there are some really good questions in the chat. So if y'all are okay, I'm going to jump to those and then come back to the prepared ones. So Jayme, because it's on topic with what we were talking about, are the signs of THC impairment different in youth and adults?
So a lot of the signs that we're seeing are pretty similar. It's not so much age that affects the impairment from what we've seen. It's more, consumption habits. Tolerance is huge. Metabolism also big. Potentially with drinks, they are talking about, does carbonation help speed up the process? So it really has a lot to do with ingestion method and how they're consuming something. I know that this is about drinks, but there's a lot that we talk about as far as different products. So lots of people think, okay, well, you're taking an edible by mouth. That's probably the same as drinking, right? But it's really different. Edibles take a lot longer to kick in. And now the beverage industry has come up with what they call nano emulsion, but essentially it's making the products or these beverages absorb faster into your body. And so we're seeing impairment happen a lot faster with these beverages than probably what someone who had used an edible before would equate to that. So just, so not so much between youth and adults. We're seeing a lot of the same signs. It really is a lot of other factors that seem to be affecting level of impairment.
Okay, thank you. And then another one that so earlier, Jayme, we're stuck on you for a second. So earlier you listed cannabis use indicators. Are they indicative of both THC and CBD users? Or were those focused on CBD users only?
Those are primarily, good question. I should have been more specific about that. Those are primarily THC users. So really what we're seeing with regard to THC impairment, not just Delta 9 THC, which gets a lot of press and talk. We also see impairment with Delta 8 THC, Delta 10 THC, THCO. There's so many cannabinoids out there, and a lot of these processors have gotten really good at extracting certain ones, and so it really depends on the product. But yes, those that I was listing are primarily we're speaking to THC or that psychoactive cannabinoid that is causing that impairment.
Got it. Okay. Heather, I'm going to jump one to you. There's a lot of questions in here for Jayme. But Heather, I think you could take this one. How long does it take to feel high from a beverage? Is it a delayed intoxication like edibles or more similar to smoked forms? I think you hit on this, but it's a very good question.
Yeah, it's a great question. And it's going back to what Jayme just kind of mentioned in that it depends. So it the companies that are creating beverages are borrowing technology from drug delivery and pharmaceutical science drug development to try to make the effects more and happen sooner. So oftentimes, what I've read about or heard is that the beverages can be faster for onset compared to an edible, but not quite as fast as when you inhale. Because when you put it in your lungs, it pretty much goes right into your bloodstream, which is why you get that immediate effect. So it's not that fast, but it's somewhere in between that. And the edibles can take 1 to 2 hours for the onset to really, in some longer cases. So it can vary from minutes to an hour or two, which is why it can be quite dangerous. And even if you're used to a beverage, if you switch to a different vendor of a beverage, you might have a different experience and get into trouble by thinking, oh, I'm not feeling the effects. I'm going to have a little bit more. And then all of a sudden it hits. So it's just really careful. It's really important to be very cautious when consuming.
That's fair. And then back to back to Jayme. This question is about roadside tests for THC. Or either one of you can answer this one, but the question is, has there been any advancement on the ability to roadside tests for THC, i.e. the recent use for OWI or MIP, particularly with increased legalization and population of THC beverages?
So as far as I know, and maybe Heather knows better than I do, but so advancement of roadside tests for THC. I mean, we speak often about oral fluid testing. We talk a lot about roadside screening devices for oral fluid, which are are good and helpful. We talk about how laboratory confirmation of those samples is even more helpful and more reliable than the roadside screeners. So you wouldn't just want to rely on the screeners alone. I mean, I would love it if we had, field sobriety tests that were more indicative of cannabis use as opposed to just alcohol and that were validated for that. I think that that would be fantastic. But to my knowledge at this point, there isn't. There's a few things that are kind of going around that seem to have some promise, some eye tracking devices. There's one that measures sway and coordination, which is nice because that actually speaks to impairment because some of these like oral fluids speaks to recent ingestion and recent use, but doesn't speak to impairment. So it still leaves all of that to the officer, which we're good at, but it would be nice to have a little bit of help.
Yeah, that's fair. The responsibility.org has done a number of green labs, especially with Jayme, and it is fascinating to go. If those of you on the webinar today haven't done that, they're really interesting. You learn so much, but it is very shocking to see the difference between a new participant and someone who's been around the block a number of times, and the difference of whether an officer can really tell. It was just very surprising. So thank you for that, Jayme. Okay, this next question: what is the half-life of these beverages? How do you know when it's safe to get back on the road? And what can we as educators and professionals say to make this an important point? I love this question.
It's a hard question.
Yes.
So because we are not, this is one of the we don't quite know answers. So because we are not privy to the technology that these beverage companies are using to make their formulations or to get the cannabinoids into a beverage, we don't know the half-life because all of that really matters. And then to respond to the how long before you drive, I would say at least 6 to 8 hours for an edible product, maybe more. But if you feel different at all, you are going to drive different. So if you consume a product and you still don't feel 100% normal, you should not be driving.
Yeah.
And to be more cautious than, the alternative also is, it's tough.
And Jayme, do you have a comparison on that? What Heather just said regarding alcohol? Like we know the curve in alcohol. Any thoughts on sort of returning to not being impaired after any one of these substances?
Yeah, so I think that chart that was in one of those last slides was excellent because I think it speaks to a perception of impairment and then performance, and then also where your THC level is in the blood. And so I really like that one because it shows that the THC levels are really low after a very short period of time. And then the performance is actually pretty poor for an extended period of time. So having done a lot of green labs and having done a few data collections where we've had people actually on a closed course operate, something to, simulate sort of motor vehicles. That has led me to believe that a lot of these individuals, especially even experienced users, think they're fine and they're not. And a lot of times people, when they speak about driving with cannabis, they say, well, I drive better high. We hear that a lot. And they're like, I'm slower and I'm more cautious. And the crazy thing is law enforcement, actually, a lot of our impaired driving arrests for cannabis intoxication and driving is actually speeding. And a lot of those people are doing that because they don't actually feel high at the time, but they are definitely impaired. And so I think, like Heather said, wait longer than you think, but it should be hours. And it really is dependent on method of ingestion. So if you're consuming via inhalation, that would be a different time frame, a little bit shorter than if you were having an edible that could last for 5 to 6 hours. So you just wouldn't really, I would say, especially for the beverages or any unfamiliarity with the product, I would say wait longer than you think. If you're a first time user, I would say have your beverage at night and plan to go to sleep. Don't even take a chance and get behind the wheel because it's just unfamiliar territory. And I think it's really hard for us to determine when we're actually safe or feeling okay to drive.
Fully agree. On that note, so let's say a traffic stop is made and both cannabis and alcohol are suspected. What is the procedure? And then are DUIs for alcohol conflated with DUIs for THC?
So when we make a traffic stop, our first, if we notice impairment, we assume alcohol. It's most common. It's what we're used. Our field sobriety tests are validated for alcohol. So that is what we use. If we have someone perform the field sobriety test, and their blood alcohol content, usually through a breath test, is confirmed to be lower than what we would suspect for that level of impairment, then we would think, we're always thinking, is this a potential medical issue? Because we're worried about safety first. But if it's not, then we're thinking, okay, could drugs be involved? And so at that point, we would look a little bit further into the stop. We'd call it a drug recognition expert, and they would run through additional tests in order to determine what drug category, whether it be cannabis or something else entirely. And what's the second part of that? Sorry.
Oh, the second part is, are DUIs for alcohol conflated with DUIs for THC?
So when we actually, for most states, so it's not every state, but for a lot of states, if the individual has a 0.08 or higher, we do not do any further testing. And based on the traffic article, we charge just for alcohol impairment, even if we know and have very good suspicion that cannabis or another drug is involved. Really, this testing limitation keeps us at just looking at alcohol and charging for the alcohol. We do recognize that polydrug use is really, really common, and alcohol and cannabis are paired together very often. And as Heather alluded to earlier, it is a bad combination. And I think a lot more research needs to be done, but a good bit has been done on looking at that combination of cannabis and alcohol. And it's showing that just a little bit of cannabis and a little bit of alcohol can be disastrous when it comes to traffic safety.
And are either one of you all comfortable talking about the need to collect that data in order to address the problem? Without the data, you can't really address the problem.
I mean, I can.
Thank
I'm a researcher, so I've done a human subjects dosing study that's FDA, DEA, and IRB approved, and I can say that the regulatory hurdles that I had to overcome to do it were absurd. It takes a very long time to set up, and it's extremely expensive. So for researchers, it's really challenging to gather this like robust translatable data set that's large enough to be used to generate like new policies or evidence-based policies. So there's a need to not only continue this effort, right, of generating data, looking at Delta 8, Delta 10, THCO, HHC, whatever new kids on the block today in the cannabinoid world, but also to look at combinations like alcohol and cannabinoids in different routes of administration. What's a beverage look like? We just don't know. I'm not aware of any peer-reviewed publication studying beverages that's out yet. Even though they're on the market. I can buy one in Wisconsin. So the horse is out of the barn, and now us scientists really need to kind of work together to collaborate on generating more data. And we also need to work with our federal and local partners to try to figure out ways that we can reduce the regulatory burden so we can get even more scientists and practitioners and others involved, right? So we shouldn't make it so it's only a couple of groups doing it. We need all hands on deck.
Yeah, great. Okay.
Yes.
I'm going to ask we're going to go back to kids in a second. So before we get there, there was a question about cannabis lounges. And I know they're popping up in some places. Jayme, I know there's some in Maryland, I believe. Are you comfortable addressing that question?
Yeah, I can talk about those. So there are a few states that have allowed what they call on-site consumption licenses. Maryland actually, when they had legalized recreationally, they allowed for 50 on-site licenses or on-site consumption licenses for the state. To my knowledge, none of that has legally moved through to where we have any yet, but I know that there are other states that do. And for us, it's definitely a concern, especially when you're talking about beverages or edibles that tend to linger a little bit longer, or people have one right before they leave and then they think they're okay to drive because it hasn't hit them, but their drive is 45 minutes. And by the time they're home, they're very intoxicated. So that's, those on-site consumption places are concerning for us. But what I've heard from some states that do have them is that the business model hasn't been great. And so they haven't really taken off in popularity. So I'm hoping it stays that way just for, traffic safety and for our purposes. But that's all that I pretty much know about that. So they're on the table, but they're not as prevalent as we would maybe anticipated they would be.
Got it. Okay. And then moving back to that, we did a lot of law enforcement. So moving back to parents and kids, I have heard even in our circles a lot of parents being concerned about kratom. I hope I'm saying that right. I've heard that pronounced a number of different ways. Are either you, Heather, or you, Jayme, concerned about those products and how are they easy to get? Are they not easy to get? And how they affect people, especially kids?
I could kick us off.
Okay.
So just for a definition, because I'm a
Thank you.
scientist.
Yeah.
So kratom is a plant-derived substance, and it can have stimulant-like effects, but so that's at lower doses. But then at higher doses, it can start to have a sedative or even opioid-like effect. So this is a really great example of the dose makes the poison, which as a toxicologist is kind of our theme. So my biggest concern is that there's an unpredictability aspect when you have this substance that can kind of act in opposing ways based on the dose. So consumers may not know exactly what dose they're receiving, how concentrated the product is, or how it may interact with alcohol, THC, prescription medications, or other substances. So it creates this kind of dangerous space for consumers. And I think the availability depends heavily on where you live. But Jayme, do you have any additional insights?
Yeah, I would agree with everything that you said. And then, I mean, I know that based on regulations for sales in vape shops and a lot of gas stations and stuff, I mean, you just, at least in Maryland and the DMV, we see a lot of advertisements just in windows in those kind of stores that advertise kratom for sale. And so, I mean, it's definitely out there, and ease of access is not as difficult as one might think, even if there is supposed to be some kind of ID check that takes place. Um, kids go out and they frequently could purchase these items or other items that have little regulations on them as far as control and product responsibility. So,
And even less research.
yes,
Yeah.
understandably so.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, that's the thing for me. So as we head into the summer, but we all have kids, what would you want? What are you going to talk to your kids about? And what would you want the folks listening on the call to either talk to their own children about or the kids in their lives? How would you like for them to wield their influence this summer to keep kids safe? Jayme, we'll start with you.
Okay. I think a little bit just to touch on what I had said earlier is, make certain that you're driving the narrative for your own children, right? Don't let the narrative be driven by an outside source. Really, as Heather said, do your research and be familiar with what's out there and what's popular, and make certain that you give your kids the total perspective. A lot of, big cannabis is really smart about their marketing. A lot of these hemp and cannabis-based beverages are really smart about their marketing. And so they're saying things like, hey, these products help with people making connections. They help lessen anxiety. They help all the things that kids want, like I want a connection. I want less anxiety, less, headache and to be at peace with myself. And so make certain that as the parent, you're sort of driving that conversation and that you're doing the research and presenting the potential pitfalls as well. And, that we all want to keep our kids safe. And so, you're sharing this information because of that reason, not because you want to be the parent that's, bringing, being someone who's, no fun.
Yeah.
So essentially just sharing it for a good purpose.
That's fair. Yes, thank you. Heather, what's your thought about what to sort of do as we head into the summer season?
Absolutely. I agree with everything Jayme has said. And just to add in going back to the reduced perception of risk, so I like to acknowledge that my kids see things differently than me. So from that lens, it's important to drive home that just because something's sold at a gas station or even at, like a wellness store or a supplement store, that doesn't mean it's risk-free. You can get sick from a vitamin, right? They all have adverse events and risks. It's really important that everybody knows that driving after consuming THC is dangerous. And I specifically didn't say Delta 9, Delta 8, Delta 10, just THC. Let's consider it as dangerous. One thing I try to tell people is that products can affect people differently, and that different products can affect you differently based on whatever the vendor is doing. And then for my kids, I always tell them, you can always call me for a safe ride. So, acknowledging that they may not make the right choice every single time. If they get themselves in a pickle, I want to be the one that picks them up and not Jayme.
Indeed. And another good conversation to, sort of assist with those with kids is talking about, oh, I saw this on the news, or I heard about this on the radio. So you're not suggesting that it's at their school or that you've heard something, but that you want to address it. You open that conversation to your kid, and then it doesn't seem like you're accusing them or suggesting that their friends are doing it. You're just sort of asking because, again, we care about our kids. So thank you for addressing that as we head into the summer. There was one more question that I missed, so thank you, Erin, for helping me with this. So this one is for Jayme. So we're going back to law enforcement. It was about open containers. So we know there's many open container laws across the country. They vary, but they're on the books. What happens if this is regarding cannabis, if a driver is not smoking, but the passengers are, are there laws against that regarding sort of open containers or smoking?
There are. I mean, you're not supposed to be smoking or consuming in public. And so there's rules obviously about that. The driving portion, obviously, it's a little difficult because there was recent ruling as far as the odor of cannabis, and that is not necessarily allowed for law enforcement to be able to use that as probable cause for the stop. So that we would need to observe poor driving or additional things in order to stop that vehicle and to look further into that. So it's a little bit different than it used to be. If we do see someone sitting in the vehicle and they're consuming cannabis, especially driving, based on what we know, as far as especially for smoking, and how quickly that takes effect, we have every reason to be able to stop them right then and there because we don't want them to drive any further and potentially cause a crash of that sort. As far as passengers go, it really depends on the state as well, because there's, even for alcohol, there are certain states that have aiding and abetting laws. Maryland is not one of them, where essentially they could be held liable as well if someone's driving impaired. So it just really is very dependent on the state as far as that impairment aspect goes. It's really addressing at this point more alcohol than cannabis. And I guess that also is probably attributed to the fact that, we're still lagging behind in our research and figuring out, what we don't know. So.
Which drives me nuts, but yes, thank you. All right. And then as we sort of wrap up, we don't seem to have any more questions, but I loved how many questions we had. So that was wonderful. So thank you for those participants for giving those questions. That helped us a lot. And again, we will send out an email afterwards with a link to the recording and to the slides and the sources. But before we wrap up, Jayme and Heather, is there anything we didn't cover or anything that you really wish people knew, but you feel like they don't know before we go? I'll start with Heather this time because I keep starting with Jayme.
When I was doing my study, I heard a lot from people that they drive safer when they consume cannabis. And then some people even thought that my study was going to prove them right in that belief. But I will share a quick anecdote from the study. So we had individuals, we gave them a Delta 9 or Delta 8 THC, and we had them go in a driving simulator and do a course. And then afterwards, I asked them how they thought it went. So we had an individual, and in this driving simulator, we build in conflicts. So like somebody cuts out in front of you, just like driving to work. So when that conflict came, they were involved in a crash in the simulator. And then when they got out of the simulator, I asked them how they thought it went. And they said, oh, I did okay. So there's this perception that they're doing fine, that everything's fine. And that may be what the THC is providing as, part of its effects, but that does not mean that you should be driving. So that's just, there's a disconnect between people's perception and then their observed behavior when we look at it in the lab or on the road or out in public. So just to be increasingly cautious and to maybe second guess your feeling of feeling fine if you know you've consumed something recently.
Thank you. Jayme.
So I really think that it's just important that people acknowledge that cannabis impairs. So whether it's a cannabis beverage or that it's a cannabis product, no matter what they're consuming, that there is a level of impairment. And that's why I think there was a question in the chat that maybe we missed that talked about access for 21, under 21.
Mm-hmm.
And so, the reason why there are restrictions on that and why there are restrictions on age is because there is acknowledgement that it impairs across the board. And so I think, and same with some of these, hemp-based beverages as well, there's acknowledgement that they impair, which is why they have that age restriction on there. So I think what I would say is, traffic safety is sort of my thing. And so really when I look at it holistically with regard to, what keeps my family safe and your all's family safe, and how do we share the roadways in the most safe way possible. And, the biggest question I have is when people say, hey, it's safer, is it safer than sober? I think that's the biggest question that they should ask is it safer than, just not consuming anything and just operating your vehicle in a normal headspace, where you normally operate with your full attention so that you're protecting yourself and you're protecting others. And so I think when people consume and they get behind the wheel, I hope that they're asking themselves that question, is this safer than sober? And I would think that they'd say, let me wait a little bit longer and figure that out. So.
Yeah, let's hope that message gets out. We're going to wrap by 3. We're going to wrap in an hour, but there is one more question that seems to really bother this person. So we're going to give them an answer. So this is somebody who wants to hammer the point home in a court-ordered class that THC is harmless. And I think you all have anyone who's listening today got that. But if that message hasn't really gotten through to this person who's clearly a user, how do we drive that point home and make it really clear to this person? Can you help this person with that?
Heather, do you?
Yeah.
Either one of you.
I know that a study was done by Marcotte. I don't know if you've read that, Heather, but it talks about advertising and sort of how to address some of these drivers who are convinced that it'll never impact them, that they're completely fine. And I think the end result of that study was essentially they said that, there's a subset that believes no matter what, even if they're regular users, that they will never operate a motor vehicle after consumption. And that group is really easy to address because they're never going to do it. And then there's a group kind of in the middle that you could sway one way or the other. So with enough education, you could sway them to be convinced that they shouldn't, after consumption. And then there's this really tough group that is just really hard-headed. And honestly, it's going to take some kind of tragic something to sway them to believe that it actually impairs. So I don't have a good suggestion for that. I guess, potentially if it's a class, there are individuals now that are being arrested for subsequent THC impaired driving offenses. There are ones that are involved in fatal crashes where THC is the causing factor. Potentially having someone like that be able to speak, in those classes might be more effective than, us just speaking about the information that way.
I agree. And I was going to go with the same thing that you came up with, in that it may take some firsthand experience, which I wouldn't wish upon them. So unfortunately, I assume this individual has been shown a lot of data, told a lot of stats, and they're just like, no, it doesn't apply to me. I'm special, or my confirmation bias. I don't think that's right. So I don't have any great advice, but maybe a speaker, to share their story. Yeah.
Too bad. And we did have a question. Can we send out the Marcotte study? So yes, we will include as much information as we can from this for folks to have from this. But I think that wraps us up today. So I do I want to make sure Aaron, I'm not missing any cues from Aaron, but thank you, Heather and Jayme, so much for this. That we had so many people on the webinar today, which goes to show that there is a desire to learn more about this. And I myself am very concerned about it in my own world. So I'm glad that we did this today. I learned a lot from both of you. And I appreciate your time and your leadership on this. And we will send out an email again with as much of the information as we can compiled. So thank you again, Heather and Jayme, for joining us today. And thank you everyone else who joined the webinar to be there. So thank you, thank you, thank you. Have a good rest of your day. Thanks.